Hello, welcome to another virtual program with Maine Historical Society. I'm Kathleen Newman. It's April 12th, 2023, and this is our Code Red Curator Talk with Tilly Laskey and Darren Ranco. As we begin, I just want to take a moment to say that Maine Historical Society recognizes that what is currently referred to as Maine is Wabanaki homelands, a place that Wabanaki people have stewarded for over 13,000 years. And wherever we are in Maine, we are on Wabanaki homelands. And we recognize the inherent sovereignty of the Abenaki, Maliseet, Micmac, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations within these lands and waters. Understanding Wabanaki history is vital to understanding Maine, and we are committed to helping provide education about this history through partnerships with Wabanaki people. Our speakers joining us this evening are Tilly Laskey. Tilly is a museum curator specializing in Indigenous art and culture. She joined Maine Historical Society in 2014, where she focuses on collaborative curation with community members, yielding significant exhibitions, including the one we're going to talk about this evening, Code Red. Begin Again, Reckoning with Intolerance in Maine, which won the American Association for State and Local Histories Award of Excellence in 2022, and Holding Up the Sky, Wabanaki People, Culture, History, and Art. Tilly is a published author with research interest extending from Maine history, the intersections between Indigenous communities and European collectors, and women and gender studies. Darren Ranco, I should say Dr. Darren Ranco, PhD, is a citizen of the Penobscot Nation, a professor of anthropology, chair of Native American programs, and faculty fellow at the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions at the University of Maine. He has a Master of Studies in Environmental Law from Vermont Law School and a PhD in Social Anthropology from Harvard University. His research focuses on the ways in which Indigenous nations resist environmental destruction by using Indigenous science and diplomacies to protect their natural and cultural resources. He teaches classes on Indigenous intellectual property rights, research ethics, environmental justice, and tribal governance. As a citizen of the Penobscot Nation, he is particularly interested in how better research relationships can be made between universities, museums, Native and non-Native researchers, and Indigenous communities. Tilly and Darren, thank you so much for being here this evening to talk about the new exhibit and to share your expertise with us.
Great, thanks, Kathleen. And I want to mention that all of those exhibits that you talked about in the opening, I co-curated with Darren. So he's been really integrally involved in MHS's exhibitions for years. So as we get started, I'm going to read a quick introduction. And while I'm doing that, there's going to be a slideshow running that will give you a couple of views of the exhibition so that you get a sense of what we're talking about as we're going through. All right. So some people have asked why Maine Historical Society is addressing climate change in our newest exhibition, Code Red. The short answer is that it's impossible to separate history from place and environment. The longer answer combines wanting to address how humans have fundamentally changed the climate by contextualizing information presented in the United Nations reports, including Code Red for Humanity, published in 2022, and finding opportunities to discuss climate and biodiversity loss in Maine through the historic collections from the Portland Society of Natural History, one of America's earliest natural history museums that started in 1836, operated under various names in several Portland locations, and legendarily burned to the ground twice. Looks like we're having some problems with that slideshow, so I'll just keep going.
Sorry about that. Yeah, keep going and I'll try.
Right.
I'll keep working on it.
The Portland Society of Natural History merged with Maine Audubon in 1961, closed to the public in 1970, and officially became part of Maine Audubon in 1972. When their Elm Street building closed, the Portland Society staff spent years moving and distributing millions of items from the museum, library, and herbarium to institutions in Maine and around the globe. Maine Historical Society holds the Portland Society's archives, but it took detective work to find certain specimens across New England. Reuniting them in our exhibition Code Red aims to put main topics related to extinction, global warming, water contamination, and cultural representation into context. Along with our 19 collaborators, including scientists, specialists, and artists, and 17 lenders, we hope people will find wonder in the old Portland Society of Natural History collections, learn about past actions, and then develop new strategies for building sustainable communities to navigate a new climate future. So now Darren is going to do another overview, and then we're just going to have a conversation about the process of putting the exhibition together. So I'm going to hand it off to Darren.
Thanks, Tilly. Really great to be joining you, everyone who's on tonight. I'm glad you mentioned that we've been doing this work together, but I feel like we really put ourselves in a box this time. So we wanted to tell the story of the old Portland Society of Natural History's archives and collections, but also have that story speak to the relevance of today, thinking about the scale of the future of humanity on this planet. So that's a small thing to consider, but it's that challenge that defines the excitement that I have for this exhibit, and I think people are responding as they visit it as well. As an Indigenous person, this work means connecting the fact that the Natural History Museum saw my ancestors as not human in particular, placing them and our creations alongside the fossils of long extinct animals in the section, I believe, Mammals of Maine. To do this work, we take on the organization of these collections as reflecting a specific worldview, one that has created the crisis we as humanity face with climate change. We also articulate how Indigenous science, and we'll talk more about this, and caretaking roles are key to our collective future as humans on the planet. The Indigenous leadership in environmental and conservation work, as identified in the exhibit by activists in the Penobscot River case, Wabanaki rematriation leaders in the Bombazine Land Trust, Francis Saktoma's multimedia work on river pollution, the call to action of Denise Altivator for the welfare of Wabanaki children, and the placement of the late Passamaquoddy elder and teacher Joanne Dana next to Bill McKibben, I should say, and perhaps I've been trying to formulate this the right way. Is she the Passamaquoddy Bill McKibben, or Bill McKibben is the white environmentalist Joanne Dana? So I think a question to think with as we ponder the relation between past climates, Wabanaki science, and the future of humanity comes from my friend and Penobscot artist Jennifer Neptune. In reflecting on our relation to past climates in her recent visit to Greenland, Jen calls out the refrain, quote, "If I could, I would bend the straight linear west, back into a circle, back to the dawn, save us all from the pit of grief, which comes with living a dystopian race of metal, greed, and longing that moves too fast to adapt and leaves the plants atop Katahdin weeping as the summer marches further north." And that is, unquote, that is why we see this exhibit, that deep call for action, as something that we can all participate in. So I'm really excited to talk more about the specifics of some of the things, but I didn't think I would be as excited as I have been for this exhibit, but I think it's such a unique experience, Tilly, that, you know, people come in, they get to kind of experience, you know, our crazy kind of take on things and trying to connect with the now, but also experience kind of, a little bit of the corner of the museum, like what it might be to have walked into that Portland Society of Natural History, which is really jarring. We don't experience museum things like that anymore. So it's really an interesting kind of experience.
Yeah, the installation is almost more of an installation art piece, because we really were trying to overwhelm people with the amount of objects and the amount of words, and how we created a space that really felt like you were walking into that old museum. And MHS is lucky enough to have those pictures from the late 60s that show the installation that we could blow up and really make it, create that space as the old natural history space. So yeah, in general, we're really trying to, even though there are a lot of words stuffed in there on purpose, we tried to situate it so that even if you don't read the labels, you kind of understand what's going on, like the top hat's right next to the beaver, for example.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And, you and I are both influenced by, people like Fred Wilson and
Absolutely.
others sort of in the museum space who are a little bit more provocative, just realizing that, the way people learn through museum experience is to force them, we don't treat them as a blank slate, like that they're kind of active learners. And I think that's been like kind of a hallmark of our work together at Maine Historical too. And I'm always excited to think about how we can do that.
Yeah. So one of the things you mentioned when you were speaking is about Wabanaki caretaking of this place of Maine. And some people wonder why there's so much Wabanaki history and Wabanaki perspective in the exhibit. But so the Code Red report that we've been referencing, that the UN put together, they have a statistic that Indigenous people, who make up 4% of the world's population around the world, steward 80% of the biodiversity of the world on just 20% of the world's land base. So that demonstrates that Indigenous science and Indigenous people are central to finding climate solutions. And that is the key reason why it's so important to look at the differences between Indigenous science and Western sciences. So I'm wondering if you can kind of put that into context and talk about how that kind of plays out in Code Red.
Yeah, no, that's such a great question. And, that the very first time that sort of terrestrial biodiversity number, 80%, that we are stewarding as Indigenous people, it actually comes from, it's reiterated a number of times in the UN's reports, but the first time it's kind of identified is in 2008 with a World Bank report called The Role of Indigenous Peoples in Biodiversity Conservation. And actually, it was back then, it was 22% of the world's land surface with 80% of the planet's biodiversity. So the new numbers, people have different takes on these numbers, but and the issue back in 2008 and the UN report Code Red makes a more definitive kind of connection or correlation. In 2008, they weren't saying anything about causation. They were just like, this so happens to be the case. Scholarship and work amongst conservation groups and UN agencies have actually shown that it is because of Indigenous caretaking and stewardship. So there have been a number of studies around in different countries across the globe, sort of measuring the effectiveness of conservation action, protecting biodiversity. And, in the last several years, there's a whole, and I can send out a list of evidence that no one wants to know about except for me. But the scholarship has really taken off. And now land trusts and conservation groups are recognizing that Indigenous people's participation, decision-making, authority in conservation work around the globe leads to the best outcomes for biodiversity and other ways of measuring conservation. So we're seeing that here in Maine as well. In the last several years, 5 or 6 years, the land trust community across the state of Maine, through the First Light Learning Journey and the Wabanaki Tribal Nations, through the Wabanaki Commission on Land and Stewardship, have created new partnerships to return and steward land, and recognize Indigenous peoples' control and leadership around conservation and biodiversity work. And while this work is just still in its infancy, it has changed the landscape of a lot of this sort of, how do we regard the role of humans in conservation work, that we must have this more active role as people who live in Wabanaki homelands, sort of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, in terms of our caretaking responsibilities. So that's become a collective effort with, really important Indigenous leadership from the tribal communities, but in partnership. And it really just, it's this like new beginning of something that is really hopeful, I think. So when I think about these new partnerships around land caretaking and rematriation led by Indigenous people, but with participation of everyone, that's where my hope for the sort of response to climate action comes from.
So for people who might not have a lot of background in this, can you talk about what rematriation is, and maybe some examples like sweetgrass harvesting and how Wabanaki harvesting of those places is important?
Yeah, no, that's sort of great. It's a great example. And of course, we talk about, the keystone, the cultural keystone species, the ones that are really important to us as Wabanaki people, like brown ash, sweetgrass, cedar, other things. One thing that, if you look at the work of Suzanne Greenlaw, who I happen to be her professor, she's my grad student, but really she's a really important teacher of mine. And the work that she's done with sweetgrass harvesters, you see in her work sort of a proof that Indigenous caretaking and Indigenous harvesting of sweetgrass actually leads to its proliferation in years to come. So it's a certain kind of rhizomatic grass that if we pick it in the way that we pick it, it'll return, even more plentifully the next year, and then successive years after that. The teaching, of course, for Wabanaki people is this notion that we take care of it, it takes care of us, right? So when we talk about caretaking, it is an active human participation role, not humans separate from nature, or even Indigenous people separate from non-Indigenous people, as part of nature, but really thinking about the possibilities of constructive relationships between humans and non-humans in our caretaking roles. So I think, that research that Suzanne has been participating in with the Acadia National Park has as its purpose to create a pathway for Indigenous access and harvesting of sweetgrass in national park lands, which is possible only because of rules changes and and things starting in 2016 under the Obama administration, and really moving up with speed in terms of recent administration, the Biden administration recognizing the importance of Indigenous knowledge and requiring all federal agencies to recognize, as of last November, recognize and implement Indigenous knowledge into its decision-making frameworks as a pathway for a better relation between humans and nature. So this is policy. This is impacting the way government makes decisions, and here in Maine, it's changing the landscape of how lands are being conserved and who is sort of making those decisions.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point that you made, being a part of nature. So, the circle that has all of the animals and plants together, including humans, as opposed to the human, like right in the center, which was really the tactic that the Portland Society of Natural History took, as well as many other natural history museums, and some even still do. And so that really kind of psychological and philosophical change that has happened in many museums to and in scientific methods, right? So like you were talking about with the White House and the policy mandates. So it's a really important point about these positive changes that have happened. And um, one of the ways that we tried to empower visitors who come to Code Red to be able to make a positive change is we have these calls to action, and some of them involve, like, on an individual level, like for children, on an individual level for adults, and then for policy changes. And so that's something that people can really get involved in Maine, is working on that policy level. Just a call out there.
Yeah, no, and this is, if people are interested in the caretaking and collaborations that the First Light Learning Journey has, has a call out for fundraising that will support the Wabanaki Commission's work. But, more fundamentally, it's just sort of creating those forms of relation and that relationality in ways that are, constructive and positive between humans and non-humans. And I think, that it's like a theme. I think we tried to say, what is the story of this exhibit? But I think it's more fundamental about the themes of things, right? Which is, you have sort of the natural history approach, which, while creating an interest in the natural world, and especially in past climates and past animals, use this framework of collecting that was that has a very specific cultural lens. People thought of it as science at the time, and maybe it still is to a certain extent, but by detaching humans and or only certain humans from that natural world, and putting my relatives as part of the natural world, but putting white European people separate from that world, created forms of racial and environmental dynamics around extraction and harms to environment that, with those sort of categorical, I'm above, you're below, really, in my opinion, and I think most people would agree with this, that has created the sort of climate crisis and other forms of ecological crisis that we face around biodiversity and other things. So that separation and categorization, which museums, right, have done. I think we always try to be inside out in museum practice, to be like, hey, this, Maine Historical, along with other museums, have used this lens of collecting and categorizing, and pretended that it was an objective scientific process, but it actually reveals, I mean, we're able to see it now more clearly, some distance from it, that it reveals actually a really specific cultural investment that has its own biases that we're, living with, for sure.
Yeah, so I think that's a really important point, and a good jump off to talk about. So you've talked a little bit, mentioned a few times this pamphlet that was created by a curator at the Portland Society, Arthur Norton, and it's called Mammals of Maine, and it was published in 1930, which is probably one of the things I find most disturbing. And in it, and Kathleen, if you want to bring up that document, if we can, in it, it's kind of hard to see, but on the bottom, he has primates, so primates of Portland, Maine, and includes just indigenous people. So it's primates americanus, I think is what he puts in there. So that was one of the ways that museums separated people, is not starting with, but including Louis Agassiz from Harvard, who refuted Darwinism and felt that people of different races were different species. And so this really tied into othering and allowing, like creating a situation where things like slavery were seen as less evil, and so this whole idea in 1930, there was still a consideration that Native people were a different race, is really pretty shocking to me. And it was something that we, in the 1860s, it was being discussed, but in the 1930s, and I should say a former curator in the 1860s he was studying at Harvard and he left because he didn't agree with Agassiz, and came back to Portland and really used Darwinism to install the museum. And Darwinism has also been used socially for purposes to keep people of color down. So, I mean, it's not like that's the best, but anyway, Darren, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's awesome because, of course, my training and PhD as an anthropologist is implicated in this, racist history. And I will say, I think, it does feel, you know, uh, 1860 versus 1930, but, I think, starting in the 19 teens and running through the 1930s and 40s, right? There's a pretty strong intellectual support for things associated with eugenics, right? Including, a former president of the University of Maine, who was also a president of the University of Michigan. So the idea that this was, in a way, an extension of kind of a set of racial hierarchies became, through, you know, the ways in which science or the language of science got mobilized through eugenics, right? Of sort of, again, the Darwinian approach to sort of the Darwinian approach to racial hierarchy as a kind of natural selection orientation, wasn't that crazy even in 1930, but it feels it feels very late in the context of the development of museums that definitely in the 19th century were oriented towards racial hierarchy that fades for a variety of reasons by the beginning of the 20th century. But the eugenics and the way that scientific eugenics kind of gets kind of implicated is really much more vast than we would think. And you can say, there's all sorts of crazy elements to it. Even, if you look at, forms of white supremacies and even in places like Portland in the 1920s, I think it's just so much more recent than we probably think to consider. It's like my dad was born in 1931. As a Native person, like a lot of other Native people, didn't know anyone who could vote, right? Those sorts of kind of recent histories that feel very distant, but experientially, kind of still have this legacy. And I think much like the debates, and I think we didn't include a lot of the things that we wanted to around sort of the ecological discussions between sort of scientists and at various, the Muir and other people who are kind of just discussing, also using sort of racialized hierarchies to kind of think about ecological past, present, and future, and sort of who should manage that. I think there was this hierarchy of like, the reason why they made us mammals and not humans was they had to differentiate the interest in land management as one that is not human, right? They had to kind of naturalize, these vast programs of extraction and destruction around which they would preserve and make humans completely separate from the small pieces of that. And I think that that's, again, categorization, racialization, like just making those connections for people where we often tell those histories in the context of American history as separate stories, right? This sort of like, the taming of the West as a, is that a racial project, or is that a, manifest, sort of expansion project of technology and sort of, et cetera, right? So how do we bring those all together? Looking, this is the box that we put ourselves in. How do we do that in a way that also sort of creates this pathway for a climate future that is just not completely dystopian?
Yeah. So one of the other important aspects, I think, of the exhibition is this idea of climigration, of people being climate refugees, but also plants and animals. And you referenced Jennifer Neptune's poem, and I want to say that the most of the exhibit is also online on Maine Memory Network, including Jennifer's poem and beautiful images of Greenland that she took. And so in that poem, she talks about caribou and the experience of eating caribou for the first time, and that it like awakened something inside of her that her ancestors experienced. And we do have a caribou taxidermied head in the exhibition, and you had insight into that. And so do you want to talk about that and talk
Yeah,
about?
and I just saw some people covering this in the press of like the attempts at reintroduction of caribou, right?
Yeah.
This has been, and I wish I could have like mapped that, maybe in the Bangor Daily News or other places, someone reflecting upon the last effort to put caribou back into the Maine woods, and it was an abject failure for a variety of reasons, but mostly because of a changing climate that was already starting to appear, but climate, the changing climate that impacted. I mean, there was overhunting, but the reason why the reintroduction efforts didn't work was a kind of climate change that the Maine forest had changed so dramatically since with the finite clear cuts of old growth that creates, if you read like Cronin Changes in the Land, like once you get rid of old growth in a forest, that changes the dynamics. Even when trees return, that changes the dynamics of sort of how water flows through, how ice forms, and so basically caribou cannot withstand. They need these deep snow patches to exist in the winter and survive through the winter, and what they were experiencing and without a forest, and then with new growth forest in the most recent thing, was a series of icy conditions under the trees that just wouldn't have happened in the context of those older growth forests. So once the hunting and the overhunting kind of like really took hold by the end of the 19th century, all the attempts at reintroduction were doomed for failure because of a kind of climate change, right? Which is how precipitation and the forest climate kind of shifted away from a more traditional boreal, with larger, older growth trees kind of conditions to, this kind of mixed hardwood, softwood forest that kind of defines the second generation of forest growth. So I think, that's such a profound change that, that in terms of cutting us off from a food staple that we had for thousands of years. And Jennifer's reflection on it is so heartfelt and real in terms of like, that's only that disconnection had only happened in the last 150 years, right? That our ancestors before that, or 160 years, had these multiple generations of relation with those caribou herds, again and again each winter, and that changing, that extraction of the old growth, and that created this kind of a climate change that really impacted the inability for us to return caribou to this.
Well, and even the language and the way you think about the moons, because you said there's a moon that's named after the caribous, and if there are no caribous, like, where does that leave you, right?
Yeah, and that points to the way of snow and ice mixing together, like, so the moon. So think moon teachings of the 13 moons are sort of indigenous categories for seasonality, right? Sort of it marks a changing condition of landscape. And yeah, and I talked to the folks at the Atlantic online. They were talking about changing snow patterns in New England, and Chris Newell also was interviewed. It's sort of like how has climatic change impacted how people even relate to snow. We're also psyched about spring arriving now here on April 12th, but it's just sort of, we have changing relations with snow, indigenous and non-indigenous across, northern New England, and sort of how that has changed in these last 20 or 30 years really is a fundamental shift that we're just now realizing. The old, talk to anyone who hunts or fishes, like they've changed where they've had to go in the last 30 years, just in a fundamental way.
Yeah, so this idea of animals moving away, plants moving away. You've written about the ash tree, which is so important to, Wabanaki Genesis stories, and that there's a chance that, generations to come, there might not be ash trees here in Maine. So, Kathleen, do you want to bring up the the snowy owl basket? That's a good segue. So one of the really exciting things about this exhibit is it allowed us to add to the MHS permanent collections in numerous ways. And one of them was purchasing this snowy owl basket that was made by Gabriel Frey and his mother Gal Frey, who are Passamaquoddy. And we'll get it open here in a second. But this piece, according to Gabriel, took about, Kathleen, maybe you can open the image of the two, of Gabe and his mom, and that shows the basket as well. So the basket is pure white, and there it is. So in order to get that white ash, it's only the very inner core of the ash tree. And so Gabriel said it took him 4 years to get enough ash to be able to make that basket. Yeah, there it is. And his mother, Gal, did the beadwork. And she said that there's over 25 different hues of white beads in that in order to get the dimensionality to really look like the snowy owl's face. And the really cool thing about that is as we were going through the slideshow at the beginning, you might have seen a picture of that installed right next to a taxidermied snowy owl that came from the original Portland Society collections, and then a picture of the owl installed in the 1960s at the Portland Society. So that's really kind of a nice conversation about snowy owls, which, like the ash tree, owls come to Maine, but if they don't have enough prey, they're going to stop coming here. And they don't reproduce, they don't nest if they don't have enough to eat. And so that's another one of these animals that's going to be moving further and further north and might not be coming to Maine again. So, Darren, did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, and I think, this is one of the things from the UN report in various reports, and it's what I think people like to say about a changing climate is be like, oh, well, Maine will be like Virginia, or something like that. We'll have those plants and animals, and that will be, nice for us, as easier winters, that sort of thing. But because the climate is changing faster than it has, faster than it has than humans have been here for sure, and pretty much forever. That, as opposed to more gradual climate regime changes that happen over thousands of years, we're looking at a 100 to 150 year dramatic climate regime change, wherein in those conditions, different animals and different plants, will respond at different rates to this faster climatic change. So it is not as simple as like every species will move from Virginia gradually up into Maine. If you were to think about it over a few thousand years, that seems possible. Over 150 years, it is simply not possible, because the rate of the change, right? So the snowy owl and what it eats will have different sort of rates of change, and then the things that it eats, the things that the snowy owl eats, and the things that what the snowy owl hunts and what they eat, like they're all changing at a different pace, right? They're all changing, gradually shifting or proliferating. Sometimes this is advantages certain species or plants or whatever, and it disadvantages others. So, but all of those rates in terms of the ecological niches upon which they're built are changing all at different rates. So it's not a simple we're in Virginia suddenly, and that's a functional ecosystem. It is a discordant set of ecosystem relations that we kind of don't know because of all these potentials for tipping points, like which species can kind of maintain their roles within even in a gradual space of change. So it's a really that if you consider that speed element, that's where things get really scary.
Well, and I think a really good example of that is ticks coming to Maine and how quickly they proliferated here and the fallout from that. So that's
Yeah, and I mean that's one that we in our we do work on climate change adaptation, the winter tick issue with moose. I mean this feels like a huge threat to moose. Where some of the recent studies that there's a 90% mortality rate of yearling moose, starting in the last couple of years because of primarily because of winter ticks. And so we're just seeing these shifts that how many yes, not enough people care about moose, or not enough people care. I think we're just trying to sort of find that strategy of change and empowerment that kind of sinks in for sure.
yeah. Um, so we're probably going to go to some questions here in a minute, but the last thing I don't know if there's something else you want to talk about, Darren, but I do want to mention about our efforts to make the exhibit sustainable. And that, so, we were doing this exhibit about climate change and we didn't want to be a part of the problem. And so many museum exhibits are like a one-time thing, and the exhibit furniture isn't reused, or the frames or mats aren't reused. And so we do all of that normally, just that's part of our ethos at Maine Historical Society. But other parts, like the label copy that you see on the wall, we make sure that that is paper and it's recyclable. Any place where we might have used plastic in the past for like more rigid types of signage, we used recycled aluminum. And the paint is a non-petroleum paint product, which are really hard to find. Even LEED certified paints, a lot of them are petroleum based. So we really made a lot of efforts, and it was not an easy transition, and it was a lot of hit or miss. And we've learned a lot through the process and where we're going to go in the future. But that's something that I'm really proud of Maine Historical Society, not only for taking on these really heady, big, meaty questions, but also for making a real effort to be green and sustainable and not be a part of the problem. So.
Yeah, and it's so funny, Tilly. I mean, yeah, that was a value for us. I mean, it was kind of like, early on when I was like, hey, we should do it. We should try this and see if people will follow along. And and like a lot of things in this exhibit, and it's always so great to work with you, Tilly, and you work so hard, and I'm so busy at times that you carry this load that it's just so phenomenal just working with you and producing these exhibits. But yeah, it's one of those like brainstorm ideas that were like, if we're going to stand for anything, with this exhibit, we should probably take as deep a dive as we can into producing some work that is not harmful, right? And I think when we first came up with the idea, and then you really did push on it, but we were like, I don't know how deep this goes. It's sort of like it can go really deep because of so much of the things we make are implicated in
Yeah,
this. Yeah,
I know way too much about paint right now. So.
right, exactly. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Darren. And so, yeah, I think it's time to go to see if we have any questions and answer if anybody's interested or just have a comment or.
Yeah, thank you both. Our first question from the audience, how do you, as curators, determine to mix history and current events, like something like it's the history of Maine and climate change? What's your thought process?
It's pretty organic, you know. As my job as a curator, I really see it as trying to diversify and contemporize what we're showing at Maine Historical Society and what we collect, so that in the future, people will have collections to be able to talk about what happened at this point in time. And so I never really give it much of a second thought to be talking about contemporary topics within an exhibition. In fact, you know, museums need to be relevant. People need to be able to see themselves, to feel like their contemporary reality is important. And so I feel like that's an aspect that is paramount for museums to be taking on.
Yeah, we always, it's so funny, the way the work gets formulated too, Tilly, is that it's kind of like we do first like the brain dumping kind of thing of like, what's the basic
25 pages.
yeah, yeah. What is the basic idea? And then sort of the brain dump is sort of the way I think we all, again, our commitment to a certain kind of museum experience and practice, because we share that, we already know that we want relevance to today through a historical set of objects, right? So we know where that, I mean, although this narrative has so many unexpected things to it, but we already kind of are committed to telling those kinds of stories. But it's kind of like what objects gets us from one place to the next in terms of this relevance of a contemporary viewer who is really it's kind of the fun part, but it's also this challenging of like, from going from 75 pages of objects to like, I don't know how you mentioned the numbers to, a very small percentage of them to tell, 6 or 7 fairly intricate sort of weaving of stories to contribute to the big story. So it's
Yeah. So
yeah.
I will say that this exhibit has 125 objects in it, which is a lot for 1,000 square foot space. And that in order to find the key objects, I mean, that was part of the challenge too, finding the objects that we wanted and that we needed, and also convincing our lenders to let us have some of their like very special pieces, including a dinosaur footprint that, it's asking lenders to loan their really precious things to us for a year is asking a lot. So yeah.
Someone else is asking, can we expect um that snowy owl basket, the color of it to change as it's exposed to light? And maybe this speaks to, what do we do to kind of protect pieces like these uh in museums, and especially when they go on display?
Yeah, I mean, UV definitely affects ash and it will change over time. So right now the piece is under very low light levels. So that's going to help mitigate that. And also, we're using like UV filters. And when it's not being used, it's closed away in a cabinet or a box, and so that it's not getting exposed to anything. So we're going to treat that piece very well so that it doesn't change color. But you might want to buy a piece and have it out in your house and enjoy it and love it, and that changing and shifting is just part of the piece having a life. So like, I've got baskets all over my house and they're exposed to light, and I'm living with the consequences, but I also really love having them out to sea.
Yeah, it's I mean, the question is like how uniquely special this is being taken care of in terms of being protected from that light exposure is you know it would be interesting to think to sort of this piece in 20 years versus a similar piece that was out in someone's home kind of exposed to the sort of more natural light over time. Like they're gonna look really different. So but that's just the nature of the things. And that no Wabanaki artist I know of presumes that someone who loves their pieces is gonna hide it away. I think that these are pieces of art that are meant to be displayed and used in many ways. So yeah.
Sure. Someone else is asking how many objects were commissioned for the exhibition, and also what is MHS's collecting mission today?
So the only piece I think specifically that we commissioned was Jennifer Neptune's poem. And the other, like the snowy owl basket just sort of happened organically. I happened to be at the Maine Indian Basket Makers Winter Market, and Gabriel had that for sale, and I almost missed it, but I saw it and was just thrilled to be able to, that he allowed us to purchase it. The other Wabanaki contemporary pieces we either had in our collection already or got permission to use, like Frances Soctoma's beautiful video installation is something we got permission to use, but she holds the copyrights. So our collecting policy, or our collecting priorities are, there are a lot of them because we do a lot of stuff, right? But I think that we're all really forward looking in trying to document this time and this place and what's happening in Maine right now, but also not overlooking historic pieces that are also very important. So it's kind of twofold, I guess.
Well, thank you both so much. This was a really interesting talk. And I think for so many folks out there that haven't had a chance to see the exhibit yet, this is a great introduction to it and to the thought process behind everything that went into it. So don't forget, folks, you can, if you visit mainhistory.org, you can purchase your ticket online to come see the exhibit in person. We are open Tuesday through Saturday, 10 to 5, and the exhibit will be open through December 30th. If you are not able to visit us in person, check out the digital version of the exhibit on mainmemory.net. Tilly and Darren, was there anything else that you wanted to leave us with before we say goodnight this evening?
Oh wow. Well, no, I think, well, I mean, this is a really special exhibit. I also want to, I don't know how awkward this is, but I'm a juror for the Portland Museum of Art's Tidal Shift Award, which is young people producing climate change relevant pieces of art. It's too delicious of a connection with our exhibit to not
For
say,
sure.
"Hey, come to Portland." And of course I brought that up to say that the ceremony for that award will be in the next couple of weeks, and that will be an exhibit, holding those pieces there too, which is, I think this, I feel like, we have these the calls to action with the youth and the adult kind of thing, and this is just such a great kind of easy connect to think of, here are some youth thinking about climate futures and climate impacts in all sorts of really interesting ways. So I really encourage folks to go to both places, and they're not very far apart from one another.
No, indeed.
So yeah, that's just a little bit of a plug. It's just, I think, a really unique opportunity for Portland and the kinds of arts and that's being supported in such a small area.
Thank you.
Well, and I think that that's a good point to say. We do a lot of collaborative programming, and Kathleen runs a really great program of events. And one of them is going to be, is it June? In June, Kathleen, where we're collaborating with the Portland Museum of Art to talk about the Penobscot canoe that shows up in all of the very large murals that we have of the Portland Society. And that canoe will actually be on display. And Jennifer Neptune and I, and probably Darren, are going to be discussing that canoe And we're calling it a progressive event. So we're going to start at MHS and end up at the Portland.
That's right. And it's actually going to be in July. We've got,
Okay.
so we don't have registration live yet, but you can mark your calendars for July 14th. We're really looking forward to that program with the PMA, and just keep your eye on mainehistory.org too for all of the great upcoming programs with ties to this exhibit. Some really interesting and some really fun stuff in our future.
Totally.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.